All right. So welcome everyone to What's the Buzz, Creating Pollinator-Friendly Communities. My name is Michelle Gluck. I'm a resource educator for Cornell Cooperative Extension, Dutchess County, in the Environment and Energy Program. And I'm super thrilled about the hosting this event on the topic of pollinators and the attendance we have here tonight. So I'll just give, short introduction, but then we have a great speaker lineup. So I definitely want to get started because there's a ton of content to share. So again, if you'd like, you can put your name, municipality or organization you're representing. Maybe if you're actively working on a pollinator focused project right now, you can share that. All of that. And basically, the way the agenda will go tonight is we'll get started with a presentation by Carissa Battle for an overview of pollinators, their decline, community connections. Then you'll hear from two municipalities, Town of Poughkeepsie and Town of Hyde Park, about their efforts that are going on focused on pollinators. And then you'll hear from Joyce Tomaselli on best management practices and how to get involved in your community and different resources. We will end with a panel discussion and questions. So we'll see how timing works. Likely there'll be enough time for maybe one or two questions after each presentation. But if not, definitely you can put your questions in the chat as we go along, or jot them down, and we will have time at the end to have that for more questions and active discussion that way as well. So yeah, and assisting me today, we have Sean Carroll, my colleague, and Carolyn Clocker. So they'll be helping out with the chat. And if you have any technical issues, we'll try and troubleshoot those with you. And lastly, this forum is we host 4 different forums a year. Actually, we have a forum coming up, a mapping and GIS forum that we'll put in the chat, I think, later on. That's happening on November 13th, a Saturday. That's our last forum, but we do host 4 forums a year on various topics, and they are supported and funded by Dutchess County. So just wanted to share that. But with that, I think we'll get started. And I'll stop sharing my screen. And I will introduce our first speaker. Okay, so our first speaker is Carissa Battle. Carissa is a research ecologist and social entrepreneur whose work is focused on plant pollinator conservation, climate change, citizen science, and social ecological connectivity. She founded and currently manages the New York Phenology Project, which some of you may be aware of, and works as a strategic advisor for organizations seeking to build capacity in the fields of conservation and education. She is also the founding director of Community Greenways Collaborative. So with that, Carissa, you want to share your screen and get started, and welcome.
Oops, let me get back to the beginning here. Okay, well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm excited to kick off an evening of conversation about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. And not just because I'm a nerd. I know what you're all thinking, seeing my bee poster in the background, but because this is a field of conservation where I see some of the most effective initiatives, collaborations, and projects from all sectors. So the public, schools, community gardeners, municipalities, professional and citizen scientists alike. And this is a field where even some of the smallest efforts, like putting one pollinator garden in your yard, tagging one tree in front of your apartment building to collect data on flowering time, is actually worthwhile in service to building a mosaic of green spaces that can ultimately connect to each other across the region, both ecologically and also socially by the people involved in stewarding those spaces. There's just so much potential to make a difference from these collective small efforts without the need for major funding or huge infrastructure investments to get it started. Of course, more money and countywide, statewide, national, strategic plans will create a faster and more robust conservation fabric. So I'm not saying this is easy to do this, and pollinators are. We are definitely in the middle of a crisis in terms of pollinator decline. But I am saying that we can get to work with what we have, where we live, where we work, while we're putting these plans in place on behalf of pollinators, plants, and of course our own health, which is inextricably tied to the functioning of the ecosystems we live in. So we're going to get started with some background info, and we'll come back to all of this in a little bit. So pollination, the technical definition is the transfer of pollen from the male reproductive parts to the female reproductive parts of a flower. This is required for all fruit, for all seed set, and for all flowering plants to set fruit. Now, flowers vary in their reproductive strategy. So some use wind, a lot of our crops and grasses use wind, there's water, but most form mutualisms with animals. So the way it works is the plant gets its pollen transferred, which allows it to have future generations, and the animals get a reward in the form of pollen or nectar, depending on what they eat. And when you're thinking of bees, it's both. And pollination is considered a vital ecosystem service. That's the framework, the language that has been used for the last 20, 30 years. But more recently, the language has shifted more to actually like a nature-centric focus, and now the UN considers it NCPs, which are nature's contribution to people, which I quite like. Okay, so the pollinators themselves. So not everything you see on a flower is a pollinator. Sometimes there are nectar robbers that are just there to like poke holes in the petals and pull nectar out. Some organisms are there as predators, waiting for the pollinators. But most of what you're seeing flying from flower to flower, particularly if it's dusted with pollen, is a pollinator. In the US, we have bats, not here in the East. In the Southwest, bats do some pollination. In the East here, we have hummingbirds. Some songbirds will incidentally do some pollination, but most of our pollinators are bees, butterflies, wasps, beetles, and flies. So most have wings. And if we're talking insects, we're talking the adults, not the larvae. So not caterpillars and so forth, but the adult version. And while we love all of our pollinators, bees are the ones doing most of the pollinating. They're super effective. Their bodies are really built for it. And pollinators range from specialists to generalists. So there are some that have one or a few different types of flowers that they nectar on and pollinate. And then some can really visit a ton of flowers. They range in their fidelity. So certain like honeybees actually will really, hit the same flower over and over again. And some are just really opportunistic, and they're gonna forage wherever they find flowers. Doesn't matter the species, as long as they can reach the nectaries with their tongue. And that's partly what determines whether they're specialists and generalists. So, both with butterflies and bees is the length of their tongue, which often matches with the length of the corolla or the nectar tube. And most pollinators don't sting. This is something that I think, makes it hard for some people to be excited about pollinators are that, folks are afraid of being stung. And I will tell you, as someone who spends a lot of time, like with my face an inch from bees and wasps with my, big old camera right up in their face, that I have never been stung in that capacity doing field research. I have been stung, and granted, wasps have a reputation for a reason, because ground nesting wasps do tend to sting. And so that certainly happened to me a lot doing field work, but actually the wasp you're seeing on flowers, they're not interested in you unless you're trying to squish them. So generally you're not going to get stung by pollinators that are doing their work. And then of course we do have native and non-native pollinators. And I must bring up the honeybee debate at this point, which can sometimes be a little bit of a contentious issue. There's nothing like honeybees and invasive species to make ecologically oriented people go nuts. So honeybees are non-native. They are brought here to do work, and they do important work. And there's a lot to love about them, and they have their place in our world and in our ecosystem for sure. And they also can compete with our native bees, or our native pollinators, and it is something we need to be mindful of when creating habitat, that we have enough floral resources to support both the wild and native pollinators, and then also, bees, which are essentially managed livestock. I know that sounds really cold, and I don't mean it that way, because I really love them, and they're a fabulous educational resource, and really beautiful organisms that just totally blow my mind. So I'm saying that as a honeybee lover, actually, but it is something that we have to be really mindful of, especially as we're talking conservation, because sometimes funds for pollinator conservation can be too heavily weighted toward honeybees and not to our wild bees. So okay, some of their native pollinators here, I just put up a few of them. I could spend the entire evening showing you all of my macro photographs of my favorite pollinators, but I'm not going to do that, I promise. So if you do get into IDing native pollinators, it's just this incredible world. There are so many great resources. I have some favorite books if you're new to it. For, bumblebees, you're looking at the colored bands on their thorax and the size. For wasps, some markers are like the size of their waist. Some of them have these beautiful, elegant thread waists. Butterflies, of course, their wing patterns and their color and size. And then our native bees, they can range from, they can look like little tiny black ants that you can barely see. And they can also look like, our giant carpenter bees, which kind of look like bumblebees with shiny backsides. But our native bees are also iridescent and green. You can see this beautiful green sweat bee here, one of my favorites, that is a common pollinator of native plants. So it's a really wonderful world of beauty. So unfortunately, our plant pollinator systems are at risk. Our native pollinator populations are declining. We're not really seeing the rusty patch bumblebee, the American bumblebee. There's like 7 Hylaeus, which are the yellow-faced bees, a number of butterflies, a lot of the smaller butterflies like the skippers and the hair streaks, and the Carner blue, of course, is a flagship species. In terms of honeybees, the hives are failing. A lot of hives are failing. Obviously, this is critical for agriculture, and a loss of reproductive success in general for wild native plants and for food crops. You can see on this graph here, in a lot of the areas where we are growing a lot of our food, is a serious dearth of native bee abundance in the U.S., which is a problem because they do actually pollinate quite a lot. The honeybees are, targeted specifically to crops like, the almond orchards in California, where there's no habitat for wild bees, and honeybees become very important in that kind of situation. But in a lot of other areas, actually, farmers are relying on native bees, whether they know it or not, to pollinate their crops. So why is this all happening? Well, as with so many conservation issues with species loss, there are reduced foraging resources, loss of habitat, basically, fragmentation, increased urbanization, which comes with, of course, air pollution, light pollution, something called inbreeding depression, which happens when organisms are separated from each other, with roads or, with swatches of land that are no longer there, and populations basically end up with a loss of genetic diversity and become less and less able to survive, and, mutations start to accumulate, and the species can fail for that reason alone. Of course, we have a lot of exotic parasites and diseases. The varroa mite is a big one for honeybees, but that also can transfer to other wild species. The beekeeping practices themselves are part of the issue for bees, which is that they're just being moved around way too much. It's stressful for them. And then they, can actually bring diseases into a lot of other systems. Pesticides, of course, I'm sure folks have heard of the neonicotinoids, which were, making some gains in banning. And then climate change, of course, is a main one. And then a synergistic effect of all of these combined stressors. So, it's like one or two of them alone may not be enough to cause a species to fail, but the combination of all of them forms this synergy that just ends up being, too much for a population or a species to manage. So in terms of climate change, the two places that we really are particularly needing data to understand are phenological mismatches and nectar gaps. So phenology refers to the timing of life cycle events in the natural world. So when a flower blooms, when an egg hatches, and obviously this timing is critical for species that depend on each other to be able to continue to survive and have the resources they need. So, so that's one, and the other are nectar gaps. So because the growing season is shifting, and certain life cycle of certain species are not matching up, there are more nectar gaps than there were in the past, and also because certain species are lost from the ecosystem. And this is where, invasive species comes in, and, all the other ecological issues that are tied, where there are just certain times in the growing season where you don't have a lot of nectar. And if in a particular year that overlaps with a life cycle of a certain species that is also having trouble with, other stressors, this can be really catastrophic to local populations, and over the large scale can be an issue for a species in general. So gathering species interaction data is really critical, using some like NPN. I don't know if folks know about that, but I could talk more about that. But and something called iNaturalist, which also looks at species occurrence data, and phenology too, really more incidentally, but anyway, so on the phenology front, we're wondering whether plants and pollinators are tracking each other. So, there's not a ton of research. There's definitely some. It's kind of a hard body of research to really nail down, but so we're seeing evidence, in both directions, but there is quite a lot of evidence that shows certain disruptions like warm springs, where the bumblebee queens are emerging too early, and the nectar resources aren't there for them to lay their first round of eggs and then have enough workers to really successfully have a nest. Native bees have been emerging about 10 days earlier over the last 130 years. Sometimes that does coincide with the nectar producing plants that they need also blooming earlier, but sometimes not. And the effects on the pollinators are likely going to be more severe than plants. A lot of the predicted models show, up to 50% loss in the near future. Unfortunately, plants, they have other issues, but in terms of loss of reproductive success, it is an issue, but they can often be more generalist, like they have multiple pollinators servicing them. So they may be able to withstand the loss of one or a few different pollinators, but particularly the specialist pollinators, will have the most issue surviving climate change. But again, we need more empirical data. That image there is of my favorite data collection assistant, who happens to be my 5-year-old. And she is tracking, that's a trillium, one of our favorites to see blooming in the early spring. But this is to show that really, this is a real thing we're doing when we're out on our phenology walk nearly every day. We built a trail and on the property, and we track both pollinators and plants. And we have an app, and we have the phone to take photos, and we're submitting our data, daily, basically, for the scientists like myself who end up actually going into these large scale data aggregation programs and using the data collected by citizen scientists for my research. So why should we care? Well, 75% of all flowering plants do require pollinators. About 2/3 of of our food, so 2 out of every 3 bites of food we eat, basically depend on pollinators. Of course, food for wildlife is dependent. I would argue that the pollinators have inherent value, regardless of what they do for us, but that could be debatable, I guess. They play a part, obviously, in terms of plant reproductive success and, plants continuing to have set seed and so forth. So, oxygen, carbon storage, general existence, those type of things are kind of important. And in general, planetary health, this is a field that is really burgeoning right now. And it's sort of the collective term for the field where human health and ecological health are really at the same table, or at least the same conference, where, it's just becoming more and more obvious that our health, so even our mental health, we're seeing that now so much during COVID that our mental and spiritual and emotional health is tied to green spaces. Actually seeing this uptick in green spaces being used and interest in green spaces as people are recognizing how important these green spaces are. So all the habitat we're putting in for pollinators is also, incredibly beneficial to us. And then, of course, economic prosperity. Neighborhoods that have a lot of green space, the houses are worth more. Obviously, we have a lot of crops that are dependent, tourism. There's so much in our economics that are dependent on pollinators. So there's a lot of reasons to care, besides their absolute beauty. I should have put that on the list too. I guess that's inherent value, but the beauty does definitely make it worthwhile too. So what can we do? I know other folks are also going to be talking about this, so I won't spend too much time, but we can really think regionally about pollinator habitat. at the same time as we're thinking hyper local, like our own yard, our own planters in front of our, apartment buildings. I mean, really any type of floral resources we are adding to the landscape are valuable. But because these small patches all have the capability of being connected is the main reason why they're so valuable. And these pictures here are examples of green spaces in New York City. But obviously, building a map of Dutchess County, I'm sure there are, already lots of great maps of the green spaces, but, layering on top all of the different types of green spaces, even thinking outside of the box on what a green space is, because pollinator habitat, they like weeds, they like abandoned lots. I mean, we're not talking we have to have pristine habitat. We're not talking we have to take our entire property and turn it into a pollinator garden and not have any lawn for our kids to play on and so forth. Like, it's not about necessarily, I mean, obviously quantity is great and volume is great and large spaces are great. But all those little spaces in between that build the mosaic, the stepping stones, the buffers, the corridors, all of these can combine to create this mosaic of green space that can allow gene flow to move across the landscape. So, if you think about, like, even in the urban core is experiencing the temperatures and the CO2 levels that the surrounding green spaces are going to experience in the next 50 years. Urban spaces are experiencing them now. So if you have viable populations in the urban core and you have connected green spaces that move out to the wildlands that surround a city, could you actually have climate change resilient gene flow moving across the landscape? This is obviously something that would be hard to prove because that's kind of on an evolutionary scale. But global change is happening rapidly and we're seeing examples of rapid evolution. So seeing whether these green spaces are connected both spatially, so physically, are they connected? And then also temporally, because you're going to have differences in when certain pollinators are emerging in the urban areas as opposed to the suburban, as opposed to the rural and the wildlands and so forth. So if you have enough people tracking these green spaces, if you have enough of the spaces themselves, we can really dial down with our conservation efforts, what we need to target, what kind of resources we need to build, and what are the most effective ways to support the pollinators, again, both for our health, and then for just the health of the landscape in general. So linking these community and municipal efforts, the backyards, the schools, and so forth, both for broad scale research, for education, and for the pollinators themselves, building these networks and using citizen and community science is really a viable path forward. It's not just, one of those, like, sometimes certain conservation activities can be more in that camp of like, it feels good to do it, or, it's nice for people to get out, or, it's a good educational opportunity. But this is one of those fields where that is not the case. It is not just a good educational opportunity for kids to build a schoolyard habitat. Like, that habitat, that patch is a stepping stone for organisms to move across the landscape. So this is a kind of conceptual graphic here to make this point that, you've got all these different players in a system. You've got the ecosystem, you've got the people stewarding the ecosystems, you have the organizations that are maybe providing resources or time or whatever it is to support the stewards. You have the communities that are made up of all of these different organizations and stewards. And then you have our policymakers who are, charged with holding the whole and helping to create the wider visions and the strategic plans, and taking into account what the communities and the organizations and the stewards and the ecosystem needs. And I think one of the main points I want to bring home, and you're going to see this tonight with everybody who's talking, is that it just takes one network catalyst. It could be an organization, it can be a person, it could be a group of people, it could be a neighborhood. You could call it a catalyst entity, because it doesn't have to be, you know, it can be a private citizen, it could be a scientist, it could be anyone. And that person is moving between all of these different nodes of the network and all of these different sort of levels of or hierarchies, and are able to speak with these different levels, and it pulls the whole network together. And it's really incredible with all of the stories that I track and the research I track, like how often, you know, tons of data are coming from one place because one person got really excited and did the work, and, you know, got their town involved, and, you know, and just basically catalyzed a whole area to start, you know, monitoring or putting in habitat or what have you. And so I know I'm very excited to hear the specifics and meet these network catalysts tonight. And I'm sure a lot of people, not just the speakers, but folks here tonight on this call are also network catalysts as well. So I tip my hats to all of you for this incredible work. So another graphic to just sum it up. This is, I put this here because this is how I think of my work as a scientist, is kind of at the bottom there of the roots of that tree, where I have a couple of different things that I'm tracking. So I'm looking at the accuracy of data collected by citizen scientists. I'm looking at the ecological significance of the various patches and how we're planting them and so forth. I'm looking at the scalability of these different types of projects. And my work, the point of my work is to inform the network catalysts who are the ones driving the work. You know, I can participate in that as well. I am also inside that network catalyst. But you don't have to be a scientist to be there. That's the most wonderful thing about it, to do any of it really. But so, you know, you've got at the top of the canopy, the different sort of sizes of projects, or the different scales of the projects, from the backyards to schools to, you know, preserves and state lands and so forth. And again, to show that they're all connected, regardless of size. And that basically this interplay between restoration and monitoring. So you have people putting habitat in, right? Then you need monitoring. You need folks to be tracking what's happening with that habitat. Do you see more pollinators? Who are you seeing? Which plants are thriving and so forth. And that can really lead to adaptive management, which I think is just the most important thing for us to be thinking about as we do this work. Because projects are going to fail. You know, we're going to put in schoolyard habitats, and then, you know, the summer happens and no one's there watering, or, you know, you're going to put in a habitat and it's going to get mowed. Like your milkweed's always going to get mowed. That's just a thing. And, you know, but so having this connection between restoration and monitoring is so important to kind of keep this loop of adaptive management going, because our needs are going to change, and you know, doing it one way is not going to work for every community, and we have to just be really flexible. So, you know, the two main things here, so the data and the habitat. So collecting this data on phenology and species occurrence, as I said before, using iNaturalist, and then USANPN, Nature's Notebook, You can do one or the other, they both kind of do both things. iNaturalist is really effective to help actually do the ID. You can get help. You don't have to, the burden is not on you. You can post it. It can get corroborated by a scientist or some expert. I mean, amateurs, trust me, I'm not in the, like, scientists are the ones who know these things camp. I've met many, many, many non-scientists who are, even better than most scientists at ID and all that. So anyway, but USANPN is aggregating the most amount of phenology data. And the New York Phenology Project, this project I run, is actually right now, just with the sites we have, is contributing like 10% of the whole national data set. And that's, across all kinds of different organizations and folks in their backyards and so forth. So we have a lot of resources to support monitoring and helping anyone get started. And, building a pollinator habitat, a garden, and then monitoring it. That's the best. Not everyone can do that, but that's a great way to really hit both of these things. So I won't talk too much about habitat because I know other folks are going to go into these details, but the research does show that urban areas can be pollinator hotspots. So for example, native bee species richness was found in a few different studies to be higher in urban areas than rural areas, which is kind of amazing. That's not the case for all pollinators and all native bees, but that has been shown in multiple systems. In terms of how to plant your patches, this is an area of research that I just came out with a study a couple of months ago that looked into this in depth about when you're planting small patches, do you focus on high resource species or on diversity? Obviously, diversity is really critical. Diversity of floral resources is critical. And the best case scenario is, you have the space to do both, to have both the kind of heavy hitters in your species, your nectar rich species, but you also have a diverse array of them to support the most amount of pollinators. But what I showed in this study was in small spaces, the diverse patches and the kind of heavy hitter patches, the ones that had, bee balm and liatris and some of these, really high volume nectar resources, they actually supported the same number and diversity of pollinators in these patches, sometimes even the higher floral resources even more than the diverse patches. So anyway, I mean, there's a lot we're learning and there's a lot more to do in terms of evaluating the efficacy of small patch planting. Because again, in an ideal world, we would not have so much fragmentation and we'd have these huge preserves, but we don't. So how best to use what we have, especially in cities and suburban landscapes? Of course, our mowing practices, leaf blowing, our ability to let some areas be a little messy. I know that's really hard in a town planning perspective, really hard. I completely get it. I think there's a way to do both. I don't think we have to ban mowing and leaf blowing, but I think there are ways we can mitigate some of the damage and play with our timing in a different way, and see how the public reacts. I think our aesthetic is changing. I really do think, like, as a I think again during the pandemic, our attraction to green spaces and wildness, I really feel like it's changing and our aesthetic is going to change with it. So obviously limiting pesticides use, focusing on natives, these are important things that'll get touched on with other speakers. So, okay, so to wrap it up, I'm probably over time, sorry.
I was about to cut you off there.
Yeah.
I didn't want to.
So I think I said everything. I mean, I think we're just, all need to determine what's possible, try to connect all the efforts that are already out there. and continue to build the network. And thank you again for everyone who's doing this incredible work. And I look forward to collaborating and hearing more about it as we work on this together. So I'll post the resources in an email sometime later. And that's all. Thank you very much. I can take questions, I think, unless I blew it.
It's okay. I think what we'll do, and thank you, Chris, I didn't want to have to say stop. Like, I think we should move on.
Okay.
But we will have the questions and discussion, at the end after all of our presenters go. But yeah, that was amazing. And I really resonated with what you said about network catalysts for sure. All right, so next we have Susan Carnes-Hecht, who will be speaking about Town of Poughkeepsie. There was a quick poll I was going to pull up that our presenters asked for, so I'm just going to launch the poll. If you all can take a look at that and fill it out. I mean, it's kind of cheating because you just got a little bit of tips there, but we're just curious kind of like where you're at with knowledge right now. Cool. All right. Share the results. Okay, so we have a pretty confident group that you know how to improve pollinator habitat. So all right, we're going to ask you a question at the end too. All right. Okay, so Susan, you can share your screen, I think. And I will introduce Susan. So Susan is chair of the Town of Poughkeepsie's Climate Smart Task Force and a member of the Conservation Advisory Commission. She originated the town's Pollinator Pathway Project, and she's also a founding member of the Mid-Hudson South chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. She's a retired speech language pathologist who currently serves as president of Vassar Temple in Poughkeepsie and sits on the board of the Dutchess County Interfaith Council, where she started a green team to bring the voice of the local faith community to bear on environmental issues and support sustainability in local congregations. All right, well, thank you, Susan, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle. Everybody can hear me, right? We're good? So thank you for that great introduction. I am very honored to be here with the scientists, and that was the first thing I wanted to say was I am not a scientist. I want to emphasize that. I am leaving the science to the rest of you. I am sort of this crazed organizing person in my community, and I'm here tonight specifically to share with you what we did in our town and how that has really mushroomed around us. My goal tonight is to empower all of you, wherever you are, to feel that you can also make it happen in your own community. So this is kind of our grassroots journey, and no pun intended. I first became aware of the project called the Pollinator Pathway from a friend of mine who lives in Phillipstown, a little bit down the Hudson from here, and someone that I know from Citizens Climate Lobby. She's very, very involved in climate advocacy, and she did a Facebook post one day about her garden, and it had this medallion hanging on her garden, and I asked her what it was, and she explained it to me, and you know, the rest, as they say, is history. I went to the Pollinator Pathway website and began to read, and this is the Pollinator Pathway, Northeast Pollinator Pathway website, and Sean, I have those links if you want to put them in the chat while I'm talking. I got very interested in doing this at home, and I was already a member of our Conservation Advisory Commission, and I really thought that would be the right place for this project to have a home in my community. So I went to speak with my colleagues there, and we agreed, and I said I was going to take it on, and we went off on our way. And using the information on the Pathway website, which is available to all of you, I reached out for guidance, and I have gotten an incredible amount of support and guidance from them. I cannot emphasize enough the amount of support and the generosity of these people in sharing information and in being there to help us. They sent me what's called the Pollinator Pathway Toolkit, which some of this is readily available on their website. And I began to have a very robust conversation with some of them who have been mentoring us. And, you know, they're there for you. There is no wheel that you need to reinvent. They really push these pathway principles, which you've already heard a little bit earlier. These are the basics. You should plant natives. You should manage your invasive species. You should eliminate harmful chemicals. And you should rethink your lawn. I want to emphasize again, I do not have a perfect garden. I do not have a perfect property at my house. I'm like the rest of you. I'm doing it bit by bit. I'm learning, and all of us can do this. So I'm not going to go over what these principles are, because I think Carissa really talked about those. But except that I wanted to make the point that you do not have to have vast acreage to participate. You can have a huge farm, or you can have a flower pot. Everyone can help with this. So one of the first things that I did was sit down and create a list of all of the potential collaborators that we could think of. So this included groups that the CAC was already engaged with, like the Waterman Bird Club, which is a very big organization that's been around our area for a long time. And you know, some of these other people that you see on here, pretty obvious. I was especially interested in engaging the school districts. There are 4 different school districts that overlap the town of Poughkeepsie, and there are a couple of pretty big private schools. And I went online, I researched the contacts, I looked for the science teachers, I looked for the environmental club advisors, and I went right next door, luckily enough, to my own neighbor, Kim Rogers, who happens to be the environmental club advisor here in the Spackenkill district at the middle school. And she really bought into this very enthusiastically, and then she helped me with her own teacher network to find the right people in the other districts. And it was very important also. We have this existing relationship with the Vassar Environmental Cooperative that has just been a very big part of this, as well as a big part of many other projects around Poughkeepsie, not only in our town, but in the city of Poughkeepsie and other communities. They are partners to so many of us doing incredible work, and the Poughkeepsie Farm Project is there. So all of these people have really helped us. And I established, one of the first things I did was I established a Google group so that we could all communicate with each other, and we did call a sort of gigantic planning meeting. This all happened on Zoom, you know, in the middle of COVID. And we talked, and we sort of identified goals and sort of roles for all these different people. And essentially everyone went off to work on their own or in small groups, like the teachers had a group and others had groups. It's been a very informal project all along. We do write periodically in the group to keep each other up to date. You know, we've talked about having a newsletter, but nobody really has the time right now. That might be something we might do later on. But really from the very beginning, the idea was to get people on board, make sure they are educated and informed about what's needed, and then empower them to go about their business and make this happen. So one of the things we did was we did get a page on the Pollinator Pathway website. Anybody can do this. This is what they call a dynamic page. So it's designed and it looks just like all the other pages on the Pollinator Pathway website. Some towns have had the opportunity to make their own websites, and then that can be linked. We haven't gotten to that yet. That is a lot of work. You know, maybe we will get there. So we have our CAC, beautiful CAC logo on there. That was designed for us by the art students at the community college. We also have one of those for the Climate Smart Task Force. And we just, we have our partners on there. I establish a Gmail for people to find me. And then where it says join the pollinator pathway, that's where we have our map, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes. I gave the people at the pathway our information. They created this page for us. And, another thing I did to help spread the word was I went to a meeting of the Dutchess County Environmental Management Council, the EMC. I shared the project with them to help get the word out. And that is an organization which helps to bring all of the different CACs together. I did a short presentation at the annual CAC Roundtable out at the Farm and Home Center in Millbrook, which was virtual last time around. So everyone shares freely. Everyone shares freely at these gatherings, which is an incredible kind of environment to be in. I've used the Cornell provides for us listservs for both all of the CACs and all of the climate smart task forces in the county. So we've used that to get information out, and that was very productive for me in terms of connecting with people in other towns who had similar interests. And when you go to the Pollinator Pathway website, you can drop down lists for the different states, New York pathways, Pennsylvania pathways, and so on. And when you go to the New York pathways list and you scroll down, and you'll see town of Poughkeepsie is there along with many other towns. The ones that are sort of purple are the ones that have links. The ones that are black do not yet have links, although I'm hopeful that they will. And using this list, I also reached out to the people directly in those communities to ask them what they were doing, so that we could begin to be in touch with each other and collaborate a little bit. So basically I did every single thing I could think of to get this off the ground. We had put out some information. This is the Climate Smart Task Force Facebook page. Our CAC did this wonderful series of workshops last year on Zoom once a month, and we had a lot of different topics. There are some people here tonight who presented for us, but we did do one on the pollinator pathway, and it was the people from the Northeast Pathway who presented for us. Some people in Connecticut in particular, and down in Westchester, who are very busy on this front. And they did an incredible presentation for us, which is on the town YouTube channel. I do have a link for that video if anyone's interested. It's really informative, and that's going to go in the chat also. Anybody can watch that. So we had a workshop. We also, as Michelle mentioned, this is a screenshot from our workshop, and that's Chet. He's from, I believe, Hastings or Dobb Ferry area, and he was an incredible presenter. And I do have this page on the Dutchess County Interfaith Council website called the Green Team, where I've been pushing, as you can see, community solar and pollinator pathway efforts. So whatever I can get my hands on is what I do. So we got word out. We spoke at the library. It went on and on. I've spoken to many groups. So that was how we did our project. And now what I would like to also do is share a little bit with you about two of our really big accomplishments. And the first one is our map. And I know that our Vassar College intern, Stephanie, I believe is here at the meeting. I want to give her props for creating this map for us. This is a screenshot I took a while ago. I think there are more properties on the map since then. We wanted something interactive for our community, even though the Pollinator Pathway website has like a kind of global map. You could put any place in the world on there. We wanted something very local because we felt that this visual cue, if you will, I come from a clinical background, so visual cue makes a lot of sense to me, really could help enable people to see how their own location could form part of a physical pathway connecting some of the larger green spaces. You can put pictures in here of your own garden. And I just learned recently that there is another student going to be doing work through the Environmental Cooperative at Vassar, who's going to be working on a different map. He's going to be creating a map of needed pollinator spaces or targeted pollinator spaces, so that people can say, oh, what can I do to help create this road for the pollinators, literally a literal pathway. And I know that they are talking to each other now. So that's our map. And again, that's on our webpage, but this is really intended for anyone in the county. And as you can see, it's not called the Town of Poughkeepsie Pollinator Pathway, it's called the Dutchess County Pathway. So we really want to share that. We really want to share that with anyone that's around here. So that's our map, and that was a big accomplishment. And then the other really major thing that I just think is the most special thing we've done is our school program. And again, Jen Rubo, who I don't think she's here, but Jen Rubo at the Environmental Cooperative really helped us put this together, and she's got a student, Madeline, who really worked with our school kids. And again, this all happened during COVID. Our hope was that by working with the schools, we would eventually, this information would make it home with a lot of these students and would really mushroom from there. And the other thing with the school program is that because we have all these school districts that overlap different towns, by virtue of that, the teachers and the students themselves, they actually all live in a variety of towns, not just our town. So they've started to take this information home to their home communities. And we now have work being done here in Spackenkill. We have a student at Arlington High School who has taken this on, which is an enormous school district that goes over a few different towns. So it is, starting to grow. I had spoken to a teacher at Arlington High School last year who herself lives in Rhinebeck and said she was going to get involved in Rhinebeck. So it's again, no pun, it's sort of growing organically. So here's a couple of examples of what they did. They wanted to make the information very, very local with a very personalized curriculum for the students to have their own projects for their community. And they made it very, very interactive. They met bi-weekly on Google Meets, and they had a theme, they had a curriculum and they had preparation, and some of it was pre-recorded and some of it was then live. And this is an example of the platform they use called the Padlet, where the teachers and students were able to post information that they wanted to share. It's really incredibly attractive. It's like a virtual bulletin board. So this is what they've been using with the students. And I know, hopefully coming out of COVID, I know one of the things we talked about initially when we envisioned this was that eventually the students would be able to come to the Vassar Preserve here in the town and work on learning how to collect seeds and then start to plant things. And they were talking about plant sales. So the possibilities are really endless. And just to show you an example of what actually happened, this is Todd Middle School in Spackenkill last spring, and we asked for a space. And we had to do a little work with the superintendent. They were very concerned. Caressa talked about, did the bees sting? That was the initial reaction. This is too close to the athletic fields. There's going to be bees. Everyone's going to get stung. We have kids with allergies, But what we found out was that a little education goes a long way. The teacher sat down with the superintendent, who's a really reasonable guy. She gave him a little of the science, she made a little PowerPoint, she explained it, and when she was done explaining it, he gave his okay. We also were very lucky in the Spackenkill district because the groundskeeper is himself a beekeeper, and we learned that long ago he had outlawed the use of, bad insecticides on the Spackenkill district properties, which was really great. But he was right there with us. We thought they were going to give us this little tiny area, and they cut this huge area for us. And then the students went out. There we are. There's me and the teacher and the kids, and this gentleman right here is the groundskeeper. The seeds were provided by the Vassar Cooperative. The kids went out and planted the seeds one day, and here it is later in the spring, filled with pollinator plants. And there it is. And anyone is welcome to come see it. So this was, kind of a model demonstration project for us. It's been very successful, and we'll see where it goes from here. We did do a press release out of the town on this project, and the town also did a press release, and we actually got some press, which I'll show you in a second. The next steps we're talking about for the schools, we hope, is to maintain the gardens going on, to continue to provide plants to them, and then to create what are called founders plots. And I don't think Carissa touched on that, but the idea of a founders plot is that you find a space to plant a large number of the desired pollinator plant, native plant, specifically for the purpose of creating seeds that can be collected in bulk and then shared. They're talking about doing this on the Vassar campus. Sometimes they target, farms where right at the edges of farms where they're not plowing and growing crops, but they have space. So these are some things that they may work on. And this is just a screenshot of our coverage in a small paper called the Southern Dutchess News, which is actually a very heavily read paper locally. So we did get some press, which was great. So these are two of the big things that we've accomplished, and we're talking now about what steps we may take next in our town. So one thing I'd really like to look at is a municipal resolution. Other towns have done this, emphasizing the importance of pollinator habitat in terms of municipal property and potentially even zoning for development. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities there. We're also looking at our town parks. The town of Poughkeepsie has about 20 parks. We have one giant park with its own nonprofit, but then we have all of these neighborhood parks. So we've set a goal for this spring to get at least one park in each of the town's 6 wards, neighborhood park, where we can do a planting, and we really engage this, we really envision this as a way to engage people in their own neighborhoods, with the CAC, with their environmental awareness. We really see this as having a lot of potential. We're going to be reaching out to our town board members to try to get them to help us with this, to identify a park in their ward and also a point person in those neighborhoods, to work with us. We're going to try to get to the town hall, the senior center, the library, and so on. I have a volunteer now who's going to be reaching out to the retail nurseries. They are selling a lot of native plants. There is demand for that now, but we would like to get more educational materials into the stores to help, promote this. And in terms of the Climate Smart Task Force, which is my baby, I would really like to have a green business challenge where businesses in the town can take certain steps to be green. And this is certainly something that I would envision them doing, even if it's a question of putting a flower box on the sidewalk, in town. Anything like that would be part of a green business challenge. So there are many, many possibilities for our town. I know there are people here tonight that are from other towns in the region. Some of them have really been excited and stepping up. And I would just, give a shout out to a couple of them. I know Dover is working, Clinton is working. I know Barbara is here. Rhinebeck is working in this area. Beacon is doing a ton. Hyde Park is doing a ton, and you're going to hear about that in a minute. So if you are here and you are in Dutchess County and either working on this or want to work on this and you're not yet involved in our overall group, I would very, very much like to hear from you. There's an email that Sean will put in the chat. We would really like to hear from you and bring you into our midst so we can talk about this together. The pollinators don't respect municipal boundaries, and we don't want to do that either. We don't want to be separated. So thank you very much for listening. That's the story of our project. If I'd be happy to answer questions if I can, or wait till later, or
Thing.
this was the organizing part. This was not the science part. So
No, that was wonderful, Susan. Thank you so much, and definitely everyone put your comments, questions in the chat. I think we will have to move right into the next presenter again. But we're really trying to reserve that time at the end. And that's great that, you know, definitely take Susan's offer up if you're representing a municipality and have questions, you know, she's available. So, all right, so our next speaker is Kathy Lane. Kathy, you can definitely, you know, share your screen now.
Reorganize it.
Okay, I'll introduce you while you're doing that. So Kathy Lane has been a master gardener volunteer at Cornell Cooperative Extension, Dutchess County since 1997. One of her volunteer activities includes teaching pollinator gardening and composting through the CCEDC Master Gardener Speakers Bureau. She is also the chair of the Hyde Park Visual Environment Committee. Kathy and Ron's home is a certified wildlife habitat through the WinStar Wildlife Institute, who's certified in 2000, and most recently with the National Wildlife Federation. So those are two home habitat certification programs. Okay.
Thank
And,
you.
yeah.
You see my screen now?
You got it. You're good.
I had a little bit of a crash there, so that's why I had to do it over again.
Well done.
Thank you for having me, and Susan, just in awe of what you've been accomplishing. So I'm going to I don't have a organized PowerPoint. I just have pictures to illustrate kind of a little bit background to what I'll be discussing tonight. So I'm the chair of the Hyde Park Visual Environment Committee. And the mission of the Hyde Park Visual Environment Committee, we're a not-profit volunteer organization committed to improving our community, and especially the visual environment of our community. We we've been in existence since 1972. We'll be celebrating our 50th year anniversary next year in existence. And one of the things that we have in place, you know, over the many years is a joint permit with the Department of Transportation. And that permit is with the Hyde Park Visual Environment Committee, the Hyde Park Chamber of Commerce, and the Town of Hyde Park. And that enables us to plant roadside gardens, plant trees along the roads of routes 9 and 9G coming through Hyde Park. And in addition to a number of other things. So that is something that we have had in place. But what got us in this direction, our traditional roadside gardens many years ago were essentially knockout roses and daylilies because they required very little maintenance. And we have evolved over the years, and I'll kind of go into how that has occurred and, you know, our interactions with the other organizations. And really what spearheaded us with the going into the pollinator gardens, and this is just a picture of an agastache along one of ours, is Barbara Hobens about 5 years ago, five years or so ago, came to our board meeting and proposed that she, you know, as was a liaison with the National Wildlife Federation, and was hoping to start have the town become a community habitat. So she came to our board to get our support, which we enthusiastically gave. And we started with designing and financing a bookmark that talked about Hyde Park Visual Environment and Hyde Park Garden Habitat. That was given out at the 4th of July parade. Barbara was holding a kickoff. We also organized some workshops that through Hyde Park Visual Environment that she presented and gave background information to. And we also, along with Barbara, scheduled ourselves for a town board meeting where we presented and gained the town's support in signing on to becoming a community habitat. So in 2016, the town registered to become an official community habitat. And Hyde Park Garden Habitat volunteers support community members to certified wildlife habitats at home, businesses, schools, parks, and places of worship. So today, the town has more than 30 certified garden habitats ranging in size and design. They include the formal gardens at the Roosevelt and Vanderbilt estates, the grounds of the town hall, a schoolyard habitat at North Park Elementary School, the Hyde Park Community Garden at St. James Episcopal Church, the Dutchess County SPCA, and a number of individual residential gardens. So this year, and Mary Langenau happened to get one of those bookmarks at during the parade, and she immediately connected with Barbara Hobens and actually spearheaded the school garden. And she now is a liaison with the National Wildlife Federation, and she's here tonight. So Mary this year met with the town board again and showed a PowerPoint, gave a lot of educational information to them about the pollinator pathways and trying to do more to provide for the pollinator pathways. So our supervisor signed the Monarch Pledge, and another not-for-profit group called Friends of Hyde Park has also been very supportive in this effort. And I'll go into a little bit further down the presentation on one of the projects that we're working on currently with them. So some of the things that we are working on, this is an example. This has been abandoned lot for many years. This is all a weed patch that was running along this area. This had the traditional, some daylilies and roses. So what we've been doing with some of the roadside gardens is adding natives to them rather than totally ripping them out, adding natives to existing gardens. And we have also added zinnias and lantana to the gardens to extend the season of bloom and also help the pollinators. So we've incorporated those into the gardens. One of the other things that Hyde Park Visual Environment has done is planted probably close to 50 trees in town along the roads, native trees, including hawthorns, red maples, dogwoods, gray oaks, red buds, etc. So we have also added those along the roadsides, and among that 50 is includes some replacement trees for some of the ones that have not made it. And here's Richard planting one of our red buds along the road here. The other thing that we do, in fact, part of what I read through is Visual Environment puts out a newsletter twice a year. So Mary provided an article about the things that Hyde Park has been doing. And with the Facebook post, the Agastache that was in the other slide was actually a video. My PowerPoint can't support that, but I posted that on Facebook showing all of the bees all over it and just stating a little piece about, the pollinators and what the plantings are for. And even since we added these zinnias and lantana, we started seeing monarchs. It's been very nice weeding the gardens and having the monarchs come along. But I wanted to discuss just one of the projects that we're doing currently that's being financed by Friends of Hyde Park. And this is a beautiful, this is adjacent to this lot is the St. James Parish. And it's a wonderful, historic, lovely little parish. And what you see along here is an 85-foot long strip of mugwort. So we, in part of working with them, we met with St. James Parish and they're thrilled about this. We began our efforts to remove all that 85-foot long strip of mugwort and replace it with a native pollinator garden. Some of the things that we have to keep in mind, even with the roadsides gardens, is we have to be cognizant of height. They did not want the height of these to obstruct the view of the St. James Parish. So we have to keep, are incorporating some cultivars of the goldenrod to keep it short. This is actually now the mugwort has been removed. So it's a very long strip and it's about 4 feet. It's kind of an odd space to be planting. But, and if along the adjacent to here in front of this is where the other garden is that I showed in the picture, one of the other gardens. So it's kind of a link. And then across the street at the post office there, they have a garden with echinacea and other plantings as well. So here we've just started this fall putting some things in. We have some fleabane in there now, some goldenrod, some seeds, Liatris seeds, the variety that is native to New York State. We have also put in some pycnanthemum, mountain mint, that we've transplanted into there. We'll be adding the native Monarda and some other natives in here. But I know I believe my time is up, but you know, we've also installed at the SPCA with a grant for a memorial garden, a large native planting. The memorial garden at the SPCA is all native plants. So I will wrap up because I believe my time is up.
Wow, that was amazing. Yeah. And well done on the timing there. Thank you. You did get a bunch of questions in the chat. I guess you could answer one. This is a pretty quick one. Who funds the plants and the trees? Do you have a municipal budget?
No, we're a not-for-profit and we fundraise to fund our improvements. We have a membership drive, so we have memberships, people who support it through that. We offer a garden tour, and we solicit donations that way, and that's how we manage to do, keep the plantings. The St. James Project, Friends of Hyde Park, is actually financing that garden and some other improvements at the St. James Parish. They've asked Hyde Park VEC to, be the lead in the gardens and things like that. So they are financing that. But yeah, we fundraise for that. For our project.
Great. Hopefully that answers that person's question. Yeah, take note. Kathy's information is here. I assume you're sharing that so others can reach out to you.
We also, Mary is really key with the Hyde Park Garden Habitat and the efforts there as well. Okay.
Great. Well, really amazing work in Hyde Park. And if you don't mind stopping your screen share, then.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. Awesome. Then, yes, then we'll move on to our last presenter, and then hopefully we'll have, enough time for a couple questions, but definitely, Kathy, you got some questions in the chat. If you don't mind looking through that.
Michelle, can you make me co-host? I don't have screen sharing. I signed in strangely.
Oh, who are you?
My fault.
Wait. Oh, okay, I see you. My co-host. Yeah, I thought I had made you co-host. All right, you should be good to go, Joyce. And as you're getting set up, I'll share your bio. So Joyce Tomaselli brings, she is our CCE Community Horticulture Resource Educator. She brings to her position a unique combination of experience in corporate marketing management and nonprofit program management, a lifelong love of gardening, and many years as a CCEDC Master Gardener volunteer. In 2013, Joyce joined CCEDC to lead its community horticulture and Master Gardener volunteer program, and she has led local and regional education initiatives on many gardening topics, including home composting and recycling, the benefit of compost in soil, invasive species and their ornamental alternatives, sustainable home gardening, ticks, and new forest pests. She and nearly 100 CCEDC Master Gardener volunteers host a large plant sale each spring and can be found teaching gardening at libraries, garden clubs, and community events year-round, including at the Dutchess County Fair, sometimes forums such as this virtual forum. So thank you, Joyce, for being here tonight, and I'll let you take it away.
Certainly, thank you. I think the challenge for tonight is to try and not get into so much detail on the most perfect pollinator garden in the world, but to reinforce the fact that each individual can do this. Each individual can do it as sophisticatedly as they want or as simply as they can. The more we share what we know, the more that we do it together, the more fun we can have with it. It's not rocket science. You don't have to be a master gardener. It's nice to know a master gardener because they can help you. But the points today I want to make are fairly simple. A little bit about the pollinators, attracting and supporting them. I called it materials decisions, and it's really decisions about what plant definition you want, but decisions you have about plant material. Site assessment. You're not going to succeed if you start trying to do this in the wrong place. So some basics about site, some basics about the plants to select, and a few other wisdoms, wise words, cautions. And whether you're a CAC, whether you're a municipality, whether you're a library contact, it was cool for me to see we tonight are seeing good resources, some of the same resources that are available throughout the Northeast that are robust, that are good for us to use, including publicity, including plant material advice, and including a lot of information that can be shared with other people that want to know more. So basically, the pollinators, and Carissa talked about this, but when you think about planting a pollinator garden, you need to remember your audience. I was in marketing communications. Who's your audience and what do they need? So there's solitary pollinators, and they tend to nest in soil, in structures. They often build tunnels. They bring nutrition in the forms of pollen down where their eggs are going to hatch. And so they have their own special needs. There's the colony formings. Some of those we don't like the yellow jackets, like some of the paper wasps, but still they need their resources to build things. And then there's many other pollinators that aren't just the wasps, or excuse me, the bees. The bees are really good at it, but many others are incidental pollinators or are helping the whole cycle here. And so when we think about our gardens that we want to establish, we want to remember that there's specialists that are depending upon specific sorts of plants, and generalists that really go after some of the really super pollen and nectar developing providing plants. So when you want to think about planting a garden, like I said, understand the habits and the needs and adapt your home landscape. But remember that if you just let your lawn go to a meadow, your neighbor in the 8th Ward of Poughkeepsie might not appreciate that that's now a mess of weeds. So try and understand what you can do, make it look deliberate, make it look ornamental, or put some signage up saying that this is a wonderful meadow garden because I'm attracting pollinators. So work your way in good fashion with your neighbors as well as you do what it is you're doing. When you're thinking about how you're going to build a garden and what your desire is and what your best design is if you think about and plan for planting things close together with a wide variety and with drifts and with clumps, you're going to be most successful in general to get your pollinators. With clumps of the same plant, it's easy for them to work through the blossoms that they like most. When you've got things close together, it keeps the weeds out. When it's close together, you have an area for sunny loving stages of the insects or the pollinators, as well as shady areas where the larvae may be feeding. So when you think about the overall, like Kathy was showing, some drifts with closely planted things is overall your goal. When you decide what plant materials to use, I'm going to go over the first 4 of these in detail in a minute. Don't forget or plan first for trees and shrubs. If you are looking at your lawn and say, I'd like less lawn and more help for our wildlife, think first if you can cite a new tree and realize that that tree that you pick now is gonna grow and keep growing. And if you pick a red maple and you know it's going to be 50 to 90 feet tall, and you 10 years from now say, uh-oh, I only planned on 20 feet, well, that wasn't a good choice. There are lots of resources that help you find plants. This is an example from the Native Plant Finder. Doug Talamy is very involved in this. It tells you about plants. It tells you how many different insects a red maple supports, different caterpillars or larvae or chewing insects. So picking trees, and all of this is available for shrubs. Master gardeners have entire presentations on this. Think about citing those and think about some of the native shrubs. There's a lot of way cool native shrubs that places are providing now. Perennials and grasses. Perennials is mostly what I'm going to talk about, but grasses are very important too. So when you decide what you want to do, think if you've got a place for trees and shrubs, as well as a smaller, lower perennials area. So let's talk about natives and invasives and the in-betweens. Natives occur naturally in a specific region or ecosystem without human intervention. So you need to know what your region is. You need to think about that ecosystem. Native plants that are in a watershed or in a wet area are going to be different than those that are more of a prairie plant. Because they occur naturally, they also co-evolve with our pollinators, with our native pollinators. It gets a little dicey when you start talking about exactly what is native, because when European colonists came, they brought a lot of things that they needed to survive. When they brought their livestock, they didn't have the grasses that livestock depended on grazing, so they brought grasses. So how far back do you go to determine native? Can be discussed. I go to these 3 places here. This is the, I lost my cursor now. Okay, I'll just do this instead. Here's 3 examples. Up on the top right here is bottlebrush buckeye, which is a fantastic, huge plant. Kathy, by the way, the slip that you gave me did survive. It's got leaves right now. There's gray dogwood there with berries that our birds also depend upon. There's white oak. The oaks are one of the trees that support the highest diversity of our insects and our pollinators. So bonap.org, you can get down to native status down to a county level. It's not a super snazzy website, but it's what botanists go to. I think it's the Biota of North American Plants is what it stands for. Wildflower.org is the Lady Bird Johnson native plant database. You can put in your zip code, you can put in your state, and then the New York Plant Atlas. So if you're determining what's native, there's some good scientific resources that you can use. And you go for natives, as we've all been saying, they're adapted to our area, they're providing food, and they are food. They eat the food, but anyhow, they're also providing food. Our native plants are providing the habitat, they're providing shelter during winter, and they're promoting all of the diversity. I needed to put in this point. If you're planting a pollinator garden, remember that not all the natives are going to behave well if you're planning on making a strip of plants that are going to stay where you put them for the next 5 years. Kathy mentioned goldenrod, solidago. That thing will, our natives will spread 2 to 3 feet in all directions in a year and keep doing it. So when you pick some of the natives, do remember that if you want something that stays more organized and keeps the plants where you want them to be, there are some natives that behave better than others. The other end of the spectrum, why are we avoiding invasives? I have a 3-hour presentation on this. It'll be 1 minute. Invasive species are introduced, and they're usually introduced by humans. A lot of the ornamental invasives that we have now, a lot of the invasives that have escaped into our wild areas were brought because they were prettier than the natives. The oriental bittersweet was prettier and more robust than the native bittersweet. Same thing for wisteria. Same thing for Lonicera, the honeysuckles. I got a call a couple of years ago. How do I get rid of all these invasive honeysuckles that you sold us? It's like, well, I didn't tell you that. That was 30 years ago. But our understanding of plants and how we manage them has changed a lot. And many of the invasive species that we had are introduced. They thrive because they don't have their natural predators, and they might seed better. Norway maple is now one of the invasive species that's regulated. We often joke that you can't grow anything under a sugar maple because it's so shady. Well, Norway maple grows under a sugar maple and can take over forests and make it a monoculture. But bottom line, an invasive species causes harm. So it's 3 things. It's introduced, it thrives more than its competitors, and it causes harm. There are plants that are misbehaved that aren't invasives. So be careful on how you judge them. The New York DEC has a prohibited and regulated invasive plants list. They're in the midst of updating it, and they and we, New York statewide, they cannot be sold, or they're regulated where they're sold and planted. And this is why we're avoiding invasive species. There's lots of good information on how to control invasive species. That's another lecture. But bottom line, they're among the top causes of loss of biodiversity. So we have natives, we have invasives. What's the in-between? There's cultivars. There's native cultivars and varieties. And botanically, a cultivar is created by humans. A joke we have at the Farm and Home Center demo gardens is Joe Pye weed is Eutrochium, and there's a Joe Pye weed called Little Joe. And when it got planted, we got laughing because the native Joe Pye weed is 8 feet and Little Joe is only 6 feet. It's still not little, but in any case, it was bred to be smaller than the native one, created by humans. Varieties are discovered in nature and then hybridized. So when you see a red bud that's white, you gather those seeds or you cultivate that tissue, and now you have a variety that nature made and we discovered and then we're using. Cultivars often don't grow true to seed, varieties normally do. Some are good, some are bad. So here we have echinacea, all right? Here we have 4 different echinaceas. The top one, do I have a cursor? There's a cursor. This one here is basically our native straight species. This is a cool new one named Green Jewel. Well, Green Jewel might look really good to our design, but it's less visible to some of the pollinators that are looking for the pinks or reds, right? This is another one who is Magnus, which looks a lot like its original, and that's probably very good to use. It might be smaller, it might be a little bigger, you can get whites, you can get other colors. But this one here, Double Pink Delight, the consensus is this does not make sense in a pollinator garden. It doesn't have the landing spaces, it doesn't have the pollen, it doesn't have nectar in a way that the normal pollinators looking for echinacea are going to be able to access. So balance what it is you're looking for, and cultivars are not evil, varieties are cool. Use common sense and don't go way overboard when you're picking some of the snazzy options. So what do we do about introduced species? There is a pretty reasonable consensus, and you can choose to keep totally native, but there's a reasonable consensus that you can supplement your native plantings by having well-behaved other plants to help you extend your season. My favorite here is winter aconite. It's from Europe. It does spread pretty reasonably. You can mow it. I love it in that it blooms through the snow, and when honeybees get 45-degree temperatures, they're on this getting pollen. And then the little wasps follow and the flies follow, and it really extends your early spring food. Crocuses are not native. They're good. You can work in tender annuals that aren't native, right? Because they're not perennials, but you can work in a lot of other annuals that help the generalists and that help provide a longer season and access of nectar and pollen. Some herbs are really cool when they go to seed. There are some sunny perennials that are really happy mixed in. So again, balance what some of your two opportunities are. This is Tithonia, and this Tithonia was blooming 6 feet tall until last night when it finally got a frost, and it had pollinators on it until the frost. So there's cool things you can do to extend your season with introduced. Now, when you're enthusiastic about going out and adding more pollinator garden to your community or your library or your church or your garden, stop and think about what it is you're working with. You really want at least 6 hours of sun, because that's where you're going to have the plants that are blooming most, that are going to have most to give to those pollinators. It's hard to have a lot of bloom in shade, and if you really think that you've got a sunny area, go out there every couple of hours and make sure that you do have a good sunny area. The morning sun is a little kinder to perennials. The western afternoon sun can get hotter, and so you want to make sure that you're choosing plants that can take the hot sun if you have a choice. Next, you're not going to change the zone in which you live, although granted, our climate is changing. This is Kingston. This little dot here is where I live in the town of Clinton, right there. And just over the hill, Barb, on the other side of Hollow Road, is a zone 5A. That's a cold zone that always gets more snow and is a little bit less kind to our plants. We live in 5B. When you get to a line almost out Route 44, you can see that Poughkeepsie gets warmer, and you get down in Beacon and you have another warmer area. You need to plan for the coldest possible rating, or you're going to plant things that are going to survive the winter. Next, if you've got buried wires, I don't know how many times I've cut the cable to our house, or if you've got electrical wires, or if you've got a septic, or you've got gas, you're not going to move those obstructions. Make sure that you think about that when you site your plan. Then, do you have drainage? Do you have water puddling? Do you have access to water, or are you going to have to haul water to a place to establish those plants the first year or two? Are you somewhere where the soil is in a reasonable condition, or is it somewhere where at the edge of a parking lot, cars parked for so long that you can't get a pitchfork in there? So think about your soil, because that's really hard to change. And you want to have good air circulation, but you don't want to have the coldest winter winds. That's going to help your plants as well as the insects and pollinators that are trying to shelter in there. Then finally, if you're enamored with a plant, if you love the plant at the nursery, read the label. It's going to tell you where it's hardy to. It's going to tell you if it resists deer. It's going to tell you about drought and heat. And it's going to tell you how big and wide that this plant is ultimately going to be. Back to trees and shrubs, it's a shame to put something in, only have to cut it down 10 years later because there's no room for it. So read the label when you're out shopping. Carry on. Remember that there's a lot of different pollinators, and so celebrate their differences. Get different shapes, get different colors, get different heights. Little bees like to have more of the open-faced flowers. Hummingbirds, bumblebees can reach into tubular flowers. Butterflies tend to like where they can land and they can kind of work their way around that flower. And they, in the daytime, like their bright things. Don't forget to have some light colors that have a fragrance at nighttime for your moths. Mix the native and the non-native. It's okay to do that. These pictures are from the New York Botanical Garden, native garden, in a couple of different seasons. Again, you see the swath of plants. They have a lot of area for beautiful, huge meadows. Remember that you also want the leafy plants, because that's where larvae need to feed so that they can get the strength that they can to pupate. Plant a sequence of bloom, make a list. Look for spring, summer, and fall. Make a list. Look for tall, look for short. Make a list and see how you can start planning, buying the material, and then mixing it in. As I said before, having big groups is good. The goal of this, a lot of this is coming from C.C. Putnam, our friend Jen Lerner, and her goal is 12 different plant species blooming at the same time. I got to tell you, that's tough. If you can get 3 to 5 blooming at the same time, you're doing good, and then you can start adding more if you can. But the more you can have, the more variety you have, the better. Then when you go shopping, again, plan for blooming in lots of different seasons. Think about the shapes and colors. I told you about the night bloomers. Think about late bulbs, early bulbs. You can go shopping now and still probably get a really good deal on some native shrubs, and you could still plant them now. You're getting a little close to fall or winter, but you can plant things in autumn. Make sure you water them well so that they don't dry out before we get super cold, but always read the label and make sure you understand what this plant is going to do. And look at all the shapes here. There's the flat of the Aquila. This looks like Coreopsis. I'm not sure. Here we have columbine, so this is probably going in spring. These are going to start blooming in summer. I mean, this is just a beautiful combination of shapes and colors and sizes that you can put together. Avoid using pesticides. In a vegetable garden, it's probably warranted to protect plants with fungicides, because in a vegetable garden, pests can damage the fruit that you're trying so hard to harvest in a short period of time. But fungicides and insecticides and herbicides all can be damaging to pollinators. If you've got a flower garden and you've got pests chewing on the plants, good, you're feeding them. You don't need to use pesticides. You don't need to use fungicides. You don't need to use herbicides. Learn about integrated pest management. I can do a whole summary on this, a whole hour on this. You learn what the pest is. You learn to scout for it early. Lily leaf beetles. Go out there and look at your lilies when they're starting to come out with leaves in spring. Pick off the beetles and throw them in soapy water. You're done. If you've got a little damage, it doesn't matter. The plants are still going to be fine. So utilize the least damaging method first. If you feel you have to use a pesticide, absolutely read the label, peel it apart, put on your reading glasses, and read when and how to use it safely. Don't spray plants in flower. Don't spray them during the day. Don't spray them when something unwittingly might come where you were addressing a pest and you just killed something that was coming after the flower. Always use the least toxic, lowest pesticide, soapy water, a hard spray of water. Those work well on getting rid of pests. And systemic and long residual pesticides just are not a good idea in any case with anywhere that we're growing. Can tell I'm passionate about that. Go back to what these pollinators need. Puddling stones is just a stone that has a little bit of a depression where water can collect, and that's how butterflies can get minerals. Sandy soil is where some of the wasps and things like that, the solitaries, can nest. Structures, you can do goofy structures, you can do, you want wooden structures that aren't treated wood. You can use a wattle fence, you can use just a snazzy looking little wooden goat or something. There's lots of ways that you can provide structures. If you are out in a rural area like we are, you can leave brush piles, you can leave ornamental grasses up. Even in an urban area, leave your material over winter. If you, for example, have a lot of pretty seed heads, echinacea, etc., maybe you can clean up the leaves, but leave the woody stems and leave the seed heads. The seed heads feed the birds, and the other, the larvae and some of the early overwintering forms, eggs, etc., of these pollinators are going to be in the leaf debris. I love going to New York Botanical Garden, going to Innisfree, going to any of the gardens around here. Make it a habit. Go once a month. I used to go to Cary when it was a botanical garden. Go look, take pictures, take notes, see what you like. Say, oh my gosh, I love iris and poppies next to each other in spring. Plan that next year. So be brave and just do it. As an individual, as a neighborhood, as a community, we can do this. Here's our pollinator pathway. Here's my neighbor Barb, and I have to do that now too, because I have to be, as an individual, competing with Barb and have my garden also indicated as a pollinator pathway. As a neighborhood, reach out to your neighbors, reach out to your community, reach out to your friends. If you are a community leader, if you are a municipality, if you are a CAC, there are all sorts of resources. Sometimes it's overwhelming. There are so many resources, but there's really good things that you can have, that you can share. If you've got a community day, Pleasant Valley Community Day, go out there with Pollinator Pathway information. Go out there with National Wildlife Federation. I loved Kathy's, bookmarks. Make some noise, talk with friends and neighbors, and here are additional resources. This will be part of your recording. There are, again, sometimes almost too many. You can drown in all the options, but the native plant finder, you can put in your zip code. With pollinators from Xerxes, there's a lot of cool stuff. There's books, as I said, the Lady Bird Johnson. There's wonderful things that are available on how to build and gardening for pollinators. I want to thank Kathy Lane and Chris Ferraro and Jen Lerner and CC Suffolk, because I took about 20 hours and put it into, I hope, about 20 minutes. That's what I had prepared today.
Amazing, Joyce. I don't know how you shared all that in that short amount of time.
Well, I got finished at 2:30 today because I kept having to making it shorter. But this is
Thank
so doable in each individual, in each community. We can do this.
Definitely. No, and just you are a wealth of information though. I've seen you present many times and I'm always just learning each time more and more. Well, with that, I mean, now we have a little over 10 minutes for some questions. Feel free to turn your videos on if you want, to make it a little more interactive. I can get us started with one question I saw in the chat for all the presenters, and then if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or raise your hand, unmute. We'll do it that way. So one question was, how specifically can these pollinator corridors help mitigate climate change? So I don't know who wants to take that one on.
I think climate change is a lot larger than our pollinator pathways, but any other speaker.
I think it depends what aspect of climate change you're talking about, because of course, anytime we're adding green space, we're adding carbon storage and You know, again, you know, a very small space is not going to do the same thing as a very large space, but the collected and combined efforts do mean something to a region in terms of mitigating heat, urban heat island effect. And so I think it, you know, it depends what parts of climate change, the aspect of climate change that's stressing pollinators, you know, having more resources gives them more buffer, gives them more ability, and gives them more time to maybe adapt to the kind of evolutionary press of climate change. So I think there are various ways that indeed, you know, this type of habitat restoration does help. And I think, you know, restoration in general, you know, we're not trying to get back to a pristine landscape, you know, that ship has sailed. But all of these efforts are helping us learn how to adapt to climate change. So I think every time we work a project and we remove a bunch of invasives and we, you know, put in native species, we are mitigating climate change, even if it's in a very small way. So definitely worth the effort.
I'd like to add a quick thought to that, just from the other community perspective. When I first was in contact with the people from the pathway, one of them said something to me that I have not forgotten, which was, butterflies are the starter drug, quote unquote. And I really believe there's something to that. This is a very accessible, palatable way to engage people in understanding about and caring for the environment. And I don't think that's a small thing, because once you get them here, then they're on the path, so to speak. I think it's important.
As other questions come in, I just briefly want to say in terms of deer and rabbit resistance,
That was me.
Rutgers has a really good database that you
What
can
does?
look up the deer resistance of plants. And a lot of our natives are deer resistant. Just look in the fields.
Which resource, Joyce?
Rutgers. Rutgers is the
okay.
New Jersey equivalent of Cornell. Just
Right.
Google Rutgers deer resistance, bingo.
I see another question that just popped in. Who maintains the various gardens in the community? This might be most applicable to maybe Kathy, like all the Hyde Park gardens, or maybe what's going on in town of Poughkeepsie.
I can say in Hyde Park Visual Environment Committee, we have a number of volunteers who are kind of adopt a garden, if you will, and with the season, weed and haul water for the annuals when necessary throughout the town, and that's how we do it.
And I would say right now we've mostly been focusing in the schools, so they're covering the range of tasks and people at their homes. But as I said, our next goal is to get into the parks. So part of setting up that project is going to be with an understanding that it's not just about planting flowers and walking away. It's about staying in there with those parks and what are the different seasons and what will need to be done by volunteers, because we're not going to be able to get really any help from our parks department. They are barely staffed as it is, and that's something we're talking about also as the town of Poughkeepsie is now doing its finishing up its natural resources inventory and adopting an open space plan any moment. Is we are going to need to be talking about budgeting in the town to support these things, to support these efforts, parks department, budget for whatever. So that's a discussion that's going to be had, I hope.
Yeah, I love that question, thinking ahead about maintenance, funding, and it sounds like Hyde Park Visual Environment Committee has done a lot of fundraising. So that's definitely, Kathy's a resource if you have questions about that in your community.
In managing the demo gardens at our building with master gardeners who really know what they're doing and are really good at it, the really tricky thing is the watering. And it's the watering when they're first established. And if you can establish them in autumn, you've got a much better chance of establishing them well. If you establish them in spring, you really have to water and then water into the summer. And I have hauled kitty litter buckets of water to walk way over the Hudson for more than you want to understand. And it's hard to do that. So think about that when you're planning, and also when you're planning to plant.
And on that note too, I think the springtime, weeding when the invasives are really small so if you're not distracted by planting new plantings and watering, you can actually get to those weeds when they're really small. And that really goes a very long way, especially if you're dealing with mugwort or some of the other ones that are so noxious that they'll just wipe out any garden that you plant. If you hit them while they're young, it's actually manageable.
Way early on, there was the comment about Seek and iNaturalist. And I typed in and people saw it, but it's so cool to get kids and teenagers and young parents and old farts like me, and some of us, to realize how wonderful Seek is in terms of identifying. And then you can link that to iNaturalist reporting. And you can set up contests, and you can really make it an interactive community sort of thing. So I answer a lot of diagnostics, and I got sent a tree the other day. I thought, I have no idea. And I did Seek, and it was a Japanese pagoda tree, and it would have taken me hours. So if you've got communities that want to engage people with technology, Seek and iNaturalist is way cool.
Yeah, on that note too, and related to friendly competition, you can actually see, if you go on iNaturalist, the neighborhoods in certain areas, let's say in Brooklyn or whatever, that have, that are doing these backyard habitats, and, folks are kind of outdoing each other in the block and in the neighborhoods. And like, you can see that a ton of data is coming from there on native pollinators. So, that's one of the ways that, without even having to look at academic studies, you can just use the power of the crowd to kind of look at and see, like, this is actually working. And I think that friendly competition between gardeners is actually quite useful to make neighborhoods really, pop in terms of supporting wildlife.
Definitely. Yeah, I think we find that with a lot of our initiatives is the competition, making it a competition helps. Friendly competition. All right, I think one more question and then we'll really wrap it up. There's best approaches for clearing well-established invasive shrubs and deep-rooted vines or spreaders. That's always a question.
So I typed into another person, but the Lower Hudson Prism, using Eric Kiviat from Hudsonia and some of his staff, if you go to lhprism.org resources and keep scrolling, there's a 75-page paper on how to deal with specific invasives using cultural management practices without chemicals. I can't find it now, but I will, if you need to, I will find it for you. And you scroll and you find the specific plant, and I'm sure buckthorn is in there. I don't remember if mugwort is, but it really tells you. So like Japanese knotweed as an example, it includes the technique that is been invented in the UK, where you put down hardware cloth, and every time it grows, it girdles itself until it girdled itself to death. So there's really good resources, and that's the Lower Hudson Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management.
Okay, we will, let's get that resource because I know that'll help a lot of people. And with that, I just want to remind you also, we will be sharing, we'll have the recording of the forum and all the presentations, copies of the presentations, and I'll be compiling, curating a list of resources as well to share with you all following the presentation. But also in that email, there will be a link to an evaluation. So please fill out the evaluation for us. That helps us to improve our programming and it helps with reporting. So it's really important. So I'm counting on you all to fill it out. And then the other thing I wanted to say was just reminding you about an upcoming forum we have. I'm putting the link to that in the chat if you are up for learning more about mapping. So that's there. It's a Saturday from 10 a.m. to noon, also virtual. Both this forum and that upcoming forum are funded by Dutchess County. So we just want to thank our funders there. Thank you to the presenters. A big round of applause to you all. It was amazing. And yeah, I hope everyone, I know there's a lot of representation from residents, from CACs here, from municipalities, from there's a high school student, I think, who wanted to get a garden started. So thank you all for being here, and definitely looking forward to what comes of this tonight and what we've all learned and shared. So
Thank you guys. Good night.
thank you.